Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. Lay back now. Let your mind sink into stillness as we step back hundreds of years. The smell of powdered sandalwood, lacquered pine, and slow-burning oil lamps lingers in the air. You are not in the city yet, not behind the palace walls, not even in silk. You're just a girl in the outer province of Fujian, somewhere quiet, somewhere the emperor will never visit, somewhere the mountains slice the sky like broken teeth and the air tastes of dust and wet clay after the rain. You are 15 or maybe 13. Your mother says you're lucky your hips have widened early, your skin is smooth, and your eyes are bright. She rubs crushed ginger across your chest to ward off spirits, while your father counts how many chickens he might receive once you're gone. Because soon you will leave. Imperial scouts have been dispatched. Every few years they go out like shadows, drifting across villages with lacquered scrolls and red stamped seals, looking for beauty. Not the refined kind, not court-trained elegance, but raw potential. Rounded cheeks, straight teeth, a still gaze. They inspect you like a carp at market. One man grips your jaw, turning it left, then right. You were told to walk, then bow, then walk again. You don't speak, and then they choose you. You don't understand why. You only know you're not allowed to cry. That night, your mother whispers prayers into the folds of your bedroll. Your sisters stare at the fire. Your brother eats slowly, silently, like he knows a ghost is already rising in your place. The next morning, you are escorted away. The journey takes weeks. Days pass in silence. You are accompanied by a few other girls, each from distant corners of the empire. They do not speak your dialect. One girl, taller than the rest, clutches a lucky jade stone tied around her wrist. Another hums to herself under her breath. You sleep in shared quarters sometimes, in inns, sometimes in storage houses watched over by guards who never speak to you unless you move too slowly. No one explains what will happen. No one tells you what the palace is like. You are not permitted. Mirrors, you are not permitted to read. You are not permitted to ask questions. Finally, after weeks of travel, the gates of the Forbidden City rise in front of you. The walls are impossibly tall, blood red, with curved rooftops that glint gold under the sun. Inside, you glimpse a world unlike anything you've known. Clean stone paths, artificial lakes, hundreds of corridors, thousands of rooms. The guards here do not speak to you either. The air smells of burnt incense and bureaucracy. You are taken to a long, narrow chamber with rows of floor mats. This is the hall of first examination. You will not be a concubine yet, not unless you pass. Not unless your skin, posture, and silence are satisfactory. Officials in robes file in one by one. Some observe your legs. Others assess your nails, your breathing, your poise while kneeling. You are given 3 new names, one to use in training, one for the registry, and one that no one will call you by, except perhaps the eunuch in charge of your quarters. The next phase is training. It is quiet and monotonous. You wake at sunrise, bathe in cold water, and learn to walk in shoes made of rigid silk. You are taught how to sit, how to bow at 3 different angles, how to keep your gaze forward without appearing disrespectful. You are taught the names of 100 spices used in the imperial kitchen, even though you'll never be allowed to cook. You are taught how to roll incense with 2 fingers, how to handle a teacup, how to cry without tears. The other girls fade into silence. The tall one, with the jade stone, is gone by the second week. You never see her leave. No one does. Once, you catch a glimpse of the emperor, but only his sleeve, fluttering in the breeze as he exits a palanquin. His presence makes everyone drop their heads instantly. You lower yours, too, not out of reverence, but habit. You wonder if he noticed you, if he even saw your face. You don't know if that's a good thing. Eventually, a decision is made. You are placed into the lowest tier of concubines, 5th rank, below even the serving mistresses. You now have a chamber of your own. It's smaller than the rice storage shed back in your village, but it has painted screens and 2 sets of robes embroidered with plum blossoms. You are expected to keep your hands folded at all times when not in use. No one congratulates you. Life as a new concubine is less grand than you imagined. Your days are structured around waiting. Waiting to be summoned, waiting to be evaluated, waiting for someone more powerful to remember you. You are not allowed to initiate conversation. May not leave your assigned area unless instructed. You may not eat meat unless granted by decree. Instead, spend most of your day learning the hierarchy. The palace is a web of invisible lines. Above you are the 4th rank concubines, many of whom have been here for years. Teeny, then 3rd rank, then 2nd. At the top are the few favored women with titles consorts, noble ladies, and of course, the empress herself. They command attention. They are guarded by separate eunuchs. They never speak to you. Below you are the maids and laundry girls, many of whom envy your status but walk faster than you ever could. You envy their freedom to laugh without punishment. There are moments, rare and strange, when you catch your reflection in the polished bronze of a water basin. Your cheeks are thinner. Now, your eyebrows have been shaped into thin lines. You no longer look like the girl who left Fujian. You look like an ornament painted, poised, and hollowed out. And yet, you're told this is the beginning of honor. So you wait. You wait for your name to be called for attendance. You wait to be summoned to a banquet. Okay? Though you are not allowed to eat. You wait to be selected to serve tea to the emperor. Though you must not look at him directly. You wait for something to change. But what if it never does? You've been inside the Forbidden City for over a year now. The seasons come and go as if behind a glass screen. A key, you do not feel them. You only observe their consequences. Winter robes in pale blue, replacing the summer reds. Different soups, steaming from the kitchens. New flowers carved into the ceremonial dishes. Different punishments. The plum trees blossom, then drop their petals. The air becomes humid, then brittle, then still again. Inside your narrow chamber, none of it matters. Each day begins the same. You wake before sunrise, cleansed by your attendant with jasmine-scented cloths. Your hair is twisted into a soft bun, pinned with lacquered wood. You perform the morning greeting rituals, even if no one of higher rank passes your corridor. You apply powder, straighten your robe, and sit. You wait. On certain mornings, you're required to present yourself in the Hall of Obedient Daughters, where 5th and 4th rank concubines are lined up in silent rows. The emperor does not attend. He rarely comes to this part of the palace anymore. His attentions lie with the consort of the 2nd moon, the favored one, praised for her poetry, her long fingers, her ability to remain silent even when mocked by the empress herself. You've only seen her once, from behind a screen of pearl beads. She glowed like polished jade, you remember thinking. She does not look real. No one speaks of jealousy, but it lingers in the halls like old smoke. You hear it in the clipped tone of a higher-ranking concubine who corrects your kneeling posture. You feel it in the way an attendant folds your robe with a little too much pressure. You glimpse it in the eyes of a girl who once shared tea with you, but no longer meets your gaze. There are dozens of you now, each a silent page in a book no one reads, and the days continue. One morning, your name is called. not for punishment, not for scolding, not even for kitchen duty. You have been summoned to attend a private poetry gathering in the pavilion of sighing cranes. It is a rare event, one where lower-ranked concubines are allowed to listen, serve tea, and observe from behind screens. You are not permitted to speak, okay? But you are present, and for a moment, that is everything. The pavilion itself is unlike anything you've seen before. Lattice windows cast shifting shadows on the stone floor. The air smells of sandalwood and faint orange peel. A zither plays in the backgrounds, slow, melancholic notes stretched across silk strings. A eunuch guides you to your station, a kneeling pad behind a bamboo screen. You position yourself, palms folded, eyes forward. The gathering begins. First, the empress enters. Then the consort of the second moon. Then others, the first flower lady, the keeper of the imperial garden, and two elderly poets summoned from Hangzhou. And then, the emperor. He does not walk like a god. He walks like a man who has been told since birth that every step matters. He wears robes so heavy they must be cooled with a fan between rooms. His voice is low, nearly lost among the instruments. You do not look directly at him, but you hear him for nearly 2 hours. You listen to the exchanges, fragments of verse, compliments about the shape of clouds, veiled critiques of rival clans embedded in seasonal metaphors. The words blur, soft and slow, like drifting mist. But then, something unusual happens. There is a pause in the reading, a moment of quiet. The emperor remarks, almost absently, that a new concubine wrote a haiku submitted anonymously by a eunuch. Your heart stalls. It is yours. You remember writing it in the dark just weeks ago and leaving it hidden under a scroll near the courtyard gate. You never expected anyone to read it, let alone present it. The haiku was about dew gathering on stone. It had no meaning, no politics, no hidden flattery. And yet, he quotes it. He does not ask who wrote it. He simply nods once and says, "That is all," and the conversation moves on. But your blood hums. You are still invisible. But perhaps now you are seen. Weeks pass. Your name begins to appear more often on attendance rolls. You are assigned closer quarters to the southern lake hall, where the emperor occasionally strolls in the mornings. You are not spoken to, but you are noticed. The shift is subtle but sharp. Your robes are upgraded, still plain, but now embroidered, with tiny cranes. Your meals are warmer. Your maids more careful. And more importantly, you are not forgotten. Once, during an early spring ceremony, you were asked to pour ceremonial wine for the first chamberlain while standing within 10 paces of the imperial dais. You sense the gazes of other concubines. You lower your eyes. Afterward, a folded note appears beneath your teacup. It contains a single character, missed. You do not reply, because you are not allowed. But still, something begins to shift in the rhythm of your days. You are summoned. One night unexpected. Unannounced eunuch arrives at your door. He says only, "Prepare." You are taken to the Hall of Tranquil Ink. It is one of the emperor's smaller chambers, rarely used. Inside, the lanterns burn lower. The air smells of cedar and paintbrush bristles. He is already seated, head bowed, drawing a fish onto rice paper with black ink. He says nothing. You kneel. Minutes pass, then he speaks. He asks you where you are from. You answer, voice steady. He asks what your favorite season is. You say, winter, because it makes the world quieter. He nods. Then he looks at you fully. For the first time, he is older than you expected. His eyes are not cruel, not warm either, simply unreadable. It's like a statue, thinking. You were dismissed after 10 minutes. Next day, you are moved to a new residence. You are now 4th-rank. The change comes with no ceremony. Your attendants bow deeper. Your maids are replaced with faster ones. You are invited to banquets. A Kia, pink placed, pale pink, placed in a silver vase beside your sleeping. Mat. Still, you wait. You have not been called again. Behind closed doors, the hierarchy thickens. You hear whispers now about rival concubines who send gifts to the emperor's physicians, hoping to manipulate sleep schedules, about others who slept, crushed pearls into their tea to brighten their skin, about disappearances. One girl was accused of looking too directly at the emperor. Another fell ill after sharing dumplings. No one questions anything. You begin to speak less. You become quieter than ever, not from fear, but from understanding. This place is not a home, okay? It is a chessboard with no end. Every piece is trapped, even the most powerful ones. Your poems are no longer submitted. You keep them inside your sleeve, written in tiny characters only you can read. One day, while folding ceremonial linens, you see your reflection again in a polished water bowl. Your face has changed, more hollow, more refined. Your hands look older. You are not even 20, and yet you have lived 1,000 years within these walls. You wonder, was it better not to be chosen at all? By the third year, you know which corridors echo with footfall and which absorb sound entirely. You know where the light falls longest in winter and which columns sweat during the rains. You understand how to breathe without being noticed, how to disappear into ceremonial silence, and how to remain still even when your name is whispered behind half-closed doors. You have become part of the palace, self-furniture with a pulse. One morning, a black-haired maid you do not recognize delivers your morning kanji. She says nothing but leaves a folded note beneath the tray. You do not open it immediately. You wait. You dismiss your attendants and let the lanterns flicker a little longer. Only then do you open it for characters, handwritten in brushstroke. The emperor is ill. No signature. No explanation. You hear the confirmation later that day, when 3 chambers are sealed and incense smoke drifts down the jade corridor. No one speaks above a whisper. The imperial physicians pass in and out, their faces unreadable. He does not die. Not yet, but everything changes again. Your rank remains. Your quarters remain. But the atmosphere in the palace curdles. The empress begins hosting more frequent rituals. Eunuchs bow even deeper. The first consort arrives to ceremonies wearing mourning grays, even though death has not come. Everyone begins preparing for what they do not say aloud. A succession. You are no one, still, but a no one who once caught his eye. That is dangerous. You begin to dream of your village again. River fog and turnip stew. You miss the sound of chickens. You miss the silence that did not carry meaning. In the inner quarters, concubines fall ill or vanish. One is accused of witchcraft, another of praying to foreign gods. You keep your head low and your robe plain. You speak only when addressed. You begin sleeping fully dressed in case you must flee at night. One day, you find a second note tucked beneath your tea. Oh, this one says, the second moon fades. You know what that means? The favorite is losing her place. And then your name is called again. You are summoned not to the hall of tranquil ink, but to the summer pavilion once used for painting. Now, a sick room of soft silks and drawn curtains. The emperor is there, paler, thinner, but lucid. He sits cross-legged on a cushion. When you bow, he raises one hand and asks you to sit. He says nothing for a long time. Then he asks, "Did you ever write about the palace?" You hesitate, then you lie. "No, Your Majesty." He nods once. "Good." Then he says, "What would you ask for if you could ask for anything?" The question nearly unravels you. No one asks you what you want, not since you were chosen. You pause. Then, as calmly as you can, you answer, "To return home." He looks at you, not unkindly. "There is no home," he says. only outside and inside. Then he dismisses you. Weeks pass. Spring returns. The plum blossoms bloom too early, an omen. And then, one morning, you are summoned not by the emperor, but by the empress. You are prepared by two silent maids, dressed in ivory, lips tinted in crushed hibiscus. You kneel for hours, waiting for her arrival. When she enters, she does not sit. She stands. You may leave the palace, she says, on one condition. You bow your head, silent. You will write no memoirs. You will take no tokens. You will forget everything. You do not answer. You will be married, she says next, to a man who owes his life to this court. You will live by the river. You will not be known as a concubine. Your pulse drums once, loud enough to drown the wind outside. You will be quiet. And just like that, the offer is given, not as a gift, but as a final command. You leave 3 days later. It is not a grand procession. One small litter, one eunuch, one servant. Your belongings fit into a single silk bag. You are not told where you are going, only that it is south. The ride takes 2 weeks. Your husband does not meet you at the gates. He is a silk merchant, middle-aged, widowed once, no children, loyal to the court. He does not speak much. You live in a courtyard home with 4 trees and a stone pond. There is a maid who brings tea and a cook who does not ask questions. The walls are low. The air smells of drying fabric and lotus root, and it is quiet, so quiet you begin to believe you've imagined it all years. Pass. You do not return to the capital. You do not write your story. But sometimes, at night, when the wind rustles the silk drying in the courtyard, you sit at your small desk and open the hidden box where you've kept the poems you were never supposed to write. One is about mist over the river. One is about a fish trapped in a bowl. And one, written in the smallest characters your brush could manage. It's about a girl who survived without ever raising her voice. You ask yourself, not bitterly, but simply, was survival enough? Or did she lose something more precious in the quiet? You never answer the question. You just fold the paper, place it back in the box, and let the candle burn down beside you. In a southern river town where the reeds whispered secrets through the floodplain wind, there lived a weaver's daughter named Leanne. Her father was known for his brocade, delicate gold, threadwork laid onto plum silk that shimmered like moving water. Leanne learned her craft early, not because she had ambition, but because her mother had died young, and someone needed to keep the looms from silencing. She lived simply, woke with the cockerel, soaked the threads, tied her waist sash, and sat at the loom for hours. Her hands developed small calluses where the thread burned through her fingers, and her nails were always stained faintly yellow from the dye pots. She found comfort in repetition, the click of the wooden heddle, the soft tug of work beneath her thumb, the rhythm of design rising from practice and memory. Her cloth bore no signature, but merchants from the prefecture often act for the one who made the plum clouds. That's how she was noticed. One spring, when the cherry trees flowered with unusual density and the river nearly overflowed its embankments, a magistrate from the north passed through her village. He was searching for brocade, he said, for a temple dedication. What he found instead was Leanne's work, so precise, so tender in detail, that he asked to meet the artisan. When he saw her, seated at the loom, her hair tied back with a blue ribbon, and her fingers red with mordant dye, he did not comment on her skill. Instead, he looked at her face for a long time and said, "You must be presented at court." Leanne blinked. "I'm not a scholar," she said, "or a singer. I don't play the zither." "You weave," the magistrate replied, "to be examined." She never saw her village again. The journey to the capital was a blur of paved roads, yellow dust, and murmured explanations from the palace eunuch who escorted her. She asked, once, if her father had agreed. He accepted the honor, the eunuch said, his voice smooth and unreadable. He was compensated generously. And so, just like thread is tied to a bobbin, she was bound to a new life, one she had never imagined, one for which no brocade pattern could prepare her. Upon arrival, she was not immediately inducted as a concubine. First came the evaluation. There was a room, circular, open to the sky, smelled of camphor and sandalwood. One by one, young women were brought into its center. They were not told what to say. A group of older women in embroidered robes sat behind silk screens, taking notes. Leanne was told to kneel, then to stand, then to recite a poem, many poems she knew. She offered a work song her mother had hummed. The judges blinked. One whispered to another. They did not smile. They did not reject her either. She was not assigned to the upper court or the hall of blossoming fragrance. Instead, she was sent to the silken pavilion, lesser wing of the imperial palace, reserved for women whose duties were mostly ceremonial. She learned posture first, then court greetings, then how to fold her hands in submission, how to avert her eyes when spoken to by men above her station, and how to kneel for long stretches without fidgeting. Each morning began with inspection. Her skin was checked for blemishes, teeth, her hair, her posture. Tutors came in the afternoon, teaching her formal speech, the book of rights, and the rules of tone. She did not ask questions. The other girls whispered in the night. One had come from a tea house in Hangzhou. Another was the daughter of a failed scholar. One girl had already been called to serve in the emperor's presence and had returned. Days later, with a gold hairpin and a hollow expression, Leanne kept quiet. She thought about her loom, about the feel of thread under her fingers. She missed her father's slow speech and the hum of morning insects. Here, the air was too clean, the silence too sharp, but in the silken pavilion, she found purpose. They asked her to embroider curtains for the annual lantern festival. She accepted eagerly. Her needlework, though not her weaving, was praised. She stitched cranes in flight, willow trees weeping, moons half hidden behind lotus blossoms. Her hands moved without thought, her eyes sharp. Her work was displayed in the inner court, and that is how the emperor saw it. It was not a sudden summons. The emperor did not call her by name, but a note came delivered by a eunuch in the pale dawn hours. She was to be moved to the hall of perfumed jade. That meant elevation, not yet a full concubine, but no longer merely decorative. Leanne did not know what to think. Was this a promotion? A trap? She had heard stories of women called forward and then forgotten or punished for attention they did not seek. Still, she packed her belongings, the combs, a prayer scroll, her embroidery needles, and a small pouch of mulberry seeds from home. Hall of perfumed jade was quieter. The women here were older, more composed. Their silks shimmered with understated elegance. They wore no perfume, only the faint trace of incense from morning prayers. Here, she was taught again how to speak to the emperor as a subject, but as a possibility, how to arrange fruit on a tray, how to dance with eyes lowered, and how to wait, always how to wait. She waited 3 months. Then, one night, her name was written on a slip of gold-threaded parchment and tied to a lantern. She would serve tea in the emperor's study. The study was large, but unadorned. No mirrors, no jade tigers, only scrolls and a bronze censer burning sandalwood. The emperor was not what she expected. He did not ask for poetry. He did not gaze at her hands. He asked about the crane she had embroidered. Why did it fly alone? He asked. She did not know how to answer. It seemed sad, she said finally, but peaceful. He nodded once, then asked for tea. She poured, steadily, without spilling. He did not speak again, only waved her away. The next day, she was assigned an attendant. Her quarters were expanded. She was given saffron-colored robes and a hairpin of jade. No declaration was made, no title granted, but among the women, everyone knew she had been noticed down. She would be watched. The imperial palace did not speak in declarations. It breathed in whispers, exhaled glances, and let status unfold like slow-moving clouds. Liane, the weaver's daughter, had no official title, no badge of rank. But the women who passed her in, the corridors bowed just slightly deeper. The eunuchs paused just a moment longer. The attendants offered her the freshest fruit first. She had not been summoned again, not for weeks and months. But that first night serving tea in the emperor's study had marked her quietly, and without ceremony. She had begun her transformation. The other concubines noticed. Some were indifferent, hiding behind their own meditations and morning scrolls. Others offered thin smiles, compliments laced with caution. A few, especially the younger ones from noble families, grew cold. Tick, they whispered, behind screens, that Liane was favored, not for beauty, but for strangeness. A reed girl, one said, more suited to a loom than a bed. But Liane knew better than to respond. The court had its own weather. She stayed still, waited. She embroidered now, not for temple festivals or pavilion curtains, but for the emperor's private gifts. He began to request her handwork, sleeve hem, a scroll cover. Sweeve stitched a landscape of plum blossoms into the lining of his robe, hidden beneath the outer silk. He sent no message. But the next time she saw that robe, worn during a ceremonial banquet, her throat tightened. He had worn it inside out, so only she would know. One evening, near the start of autumn, she was summoned again. This time, not to the study, but to the private garden, a place few ever saw. It was twilight when she arrived. The lanterns had not yet been lit. The sky was the color of burnt tea leaves, and the crickets were beginning their long, whispering chorus. The emperor stood by a magnolia tree. He did not turn when she approached, only said, "You don't perfume your sleeves." She bowed. "The dye clings to them from my work. I thought it disrespectful to mask it." He turned, studied her face. "I prefer it," he said. And just like that, she was permitted to speak. He asked her about her childhood, her father's dye pots, her favorite threads. She answered simply. She did not embellish. She did not flatter. The emperor laughed once when she described the village cat that used to sleep under her loom, shedding white fur onto plum silk. Then he said nothing for a long time, just listened to the wind. That night, she was given a new title, not consort, not lady, but C.N. Weaver Maiden, a nod to both her skill and to an old tale, the cowherd and the weaver girl, celestial lovers separated by the stars. The title was unofficial, but the palace remembered stories. Now she could not walk the corridors unnoticed. Favor in the palace was as heavy as snow. It fell silently, and it buried just as easily. With elevation came surveillance. Her food was tasted in her presence. Her attendants were changed without warning. Once, she discovered a hairpin missing, only to find it the next day placed carefully at the edge of her sleeping mat. Someone had touched her things. Someone always did. She learned not to react, and still she embroidered. Then came the season of naming. Each year, the emperor reviewed his concubines' ranks. Some were raised. Some were moved to remote quarters. A few were sent away to temples or distant estates. Whispers floated that Liane would be officially ranked this time. Second-grade consort. A place in the garden wing. The possibilities flitted through the court like dragonflies. On the day of the announcements, her name was not red dot. It was not elevated, nor was it demoted. It was simply absent, a silence more piercing than words. In the days that followed, Liane's privileges were unchanged. Her robes were still fine, her meals untouched by delay. But now, the glances sharpened. Whispers returned. She felt out of favor. Someone murmured near a screen. "No, she's being protected," another said. She embroidered something offensive. She refused something. She knows something. The truth was, Leanne did not know. She had not seen the Emperor in weeks. But one morning, as she walked to the stone bridge behind the Hall of Tranquil Pines, she noticed something strange. A strip of blue fabric dyed with crushed woad, the same as her village tied discreetly around the base of the bridge post. It was gone the next day, but she recognized the knot her father had taught her that one, a signal for a hidden thread. A week later, she was summoned again. The Emperor sat alone in the tea room, wearing simple robes. He looked tired, older. He did not ask for tea. He asked, "What is it like to be forgotten?" She didn't answer, not because she didn't know, but because she wasn't sure he wanted honesty. "Still, Kay," after a long silence, she said softly, "It makes the days echo louder." He nodded. Then, without looking at her, he whispered, "I remember you," and dismissed her. When she returned to her quarters, she found three things: a scroll with her father's name written in ink, safe, alive, appointed to a provincial weaving, POSTA silk pouch containing lotus seeds, her favorite treat, ENSALTED dot into hairpin, simple, wooden, but carved with the plum blossom she once embroidered. No one mentioned her at court. Her name was never formally entered into the annals, but her embroidery continued to be requested. Her quarters remained untouched. The wind returned, and once again she became still. Waiting was her silence protection, or erasure. She had never been the most beautiful. That title went to the consort, with cheeks like peaches and kohl-lined eyes that fluttered like calligraphy strokes in the wind. Nor was she the most powerful. That position belonged to the senior lady from the Lee clan, strategic, shrewd, always draped in red lacquered silks that whispered of old money and older rivalries. Leanne was something else, a memory, a thread, not removed, not cut, but simply looped and left to dangle, half forgotten, yet still attached. Autumn turned to winter, and with it came the hush of white robes and bare branches. In the palace, winter was a time of withdrawal, less travel between quarters, fewer audiences. Most of the higher-ranking consorts stayed by the braziers, wrapped in fox fur, playing wakey and nibbling candied ginger. But Leanne still rose early. She walked the gardens before dawn, her slippers wet with frost, her sleeves scented with cedar from the brazier coals. She embroidered, she waited, and sometimes she wondered, not about her future, for that had been muted long ago, but about the Emperor. What it meant to be favored without title, remembered but not raised, a ghost of affection, floating just above the hierarchy. Then news arrived in the hush of morning. The Emperor had fallen ill. It was not announced formally, not at first, but the signs crept through the court like smoke. Under doors, his music sessions were canceled, morning rites delayed. The cooks began boiling stronger broths. The old herbalists returned from retirement, summoned in silence. Leanne heard it from a guard first, then from an attendant, then from a laundress who wept softly into the sleeve of a robe. She had ironed 100 times. The Emperor had not asked for her, but Leanne knew how thread behaved. Some knots tightened when pulled, others loosened in time. Weeks passed. The palace grew quieter still. The consort of the Red Pavilion made an offering at the ancestral shrine. The senior lady from the Lee clan stopped smiling altogether. The grand historian had begun preparing to scrolls one for succession, one for mourning, and then the Emperor summoned Leanne, not to his study, not to the gardens, but to the old pavilion, by the inner lake, the one no one had used since the last empress had died there. The walk was long. Snow had just begun to fall, and the stone paths were slick. with slush and silence. Her escort did not speak. She wore her plainest robe, a faded ink gray one with loose sleeves. Her only adornment was the wooden hairpin with the plum blossom. When she entered the pavilion, she saw no guards, only an old man lying on a couch by a small fire. The emperor, his face was thin, pale, but his eyes were alert, sharper than she remembered. He gestured for her to sit, and so she did. They did not speak for a long while. He watched the fire. She watched her hands, folded in her lap. Then he asked, "Do you know why I never gave you a title?" She shook her head. He did not explain. Instead, he handed her something, a silk scroll, wrapped and tied in faded red thread. When she opened it, her breath caught. It was her embroidery. Not new, not even her best work. An early one, slightly uneven in places. The threads were beginning to pull at the corners. It depicted a heron standing alone in a rice field, with only a single reed bowing in the breeze. She had made it when she was 14. For her mother, it had been lost in a fire, or so she thought. "I found it in your father's belongings," the emperor said softly. "Years ago, before I ever met you." He looked at her then. I remembered the thread, the way it moved. She could not speak. "I never gave you a title," he continued, "because titles bind. They elevate, they crush. You were more useful outside of rank." She looked up, confused. He explained. For years, the emperor had used Lian as a quiet courier, a weaver of invisible signals. Her embroideries had traveled beyond the palace to military advisors, old nobles, even rival courts. Each design carried symbols, metaphors, instructions hidden in petals and clouds. Only a few knew, and even fewer noticed, because she was untealed, unimportant, invisible, and therefore free to move. Lian felt dizzy. She thought back over the years. The scroll cases, the silk hems, the linings of robes she embroidered without explanation. She thought she had been forgotten, but she had been remembered all along. Used, trusted, a thread looped through history. She returned to her quarters that night. In silence, no guards followed, but the next morning, she awoke to find her room changed. No new silks, no jewels, only scrolls, stacks of them, designs, dot maps, poems, with notes in the margins, and a new loom, polished, oiled, waiting. The emperor lived another month. She saw him only once more. Briefly, he smiled. She bowed. No words were exchanged. After his death, the court changed. A new ruler, a younger son, sweeping reforms, fresh appointments, more banquets, new alliances. Some concubines were dismissed. Others elevated, but Lian was neither need. Her name remained absent. No title, no retirement estate. She simply stayed. Years passed. Her hair turned to silver, but she continued to embroider. Whispers surrounded her still. Some called her a relic, others a spy, but most called her the weaver widow. Though she had never been a wife. One cold spring morning, a young concubine knocked at her door. She was trembling, her robe too thin. She asked if Lian could embroider a prayer cloth for her mother, who was ill. Lian nodded, and as she threaded the needle, she asked softly, what flower did she love? The girl replied, plum blossoms. Lian smiled, and began to sew. The wind blew softly outside. Petals drifted across the window. The loom creaked like an old song, and somewhere in the palace, a thread, one that had never been knotted nor cut, held firm. There was a saying in the inner court of the Forbidden City, whispered by chambermaids and young eunuchs who knew better than to speak it aloud. It went like this: better to be the broom that sweeps the floor than the flower that pleases the emperor. Flowers wilt, but brooms survived the seasons. In the spring of the year of the horse, a young girl from the southern border province of Lingnan was sent to the palace. Her name was Iwan Mei. She was 15. Mei had grown up in the shadow of mountains and rivers. Her father was a merchant who traded salt and lacquerware. Her mother had once been a concubine in a provincial magistrate's home till she was gifted to her father as part of a repayment for a debt. Mei had been raised with discipline but no affection. Was taught to kneel properly before she learned how to skip stones. Her beauty was quiet, eyes too steady, posture too proud. She did not sing well, she did not giggle, but she could listen. More importantly, she could memorize. That was why she was chosen, not because of her charms, but because of her silence. The journey to the capital took 27 days. She traveled in a caravan of 7 girls, all from minor, noble, or merchant households. None of them were important enough to enter the court by right, but all of them were gifts, part of a seasonal tribute to the emperor from far-flung provinces. The real selection happened after arrival. Not all would be chosen. Some would be dismissed. Some would be married off. 2 low-level officials. 1 or 2 might be selected to serve in the outer court as attendants or musicians, and one might be elevated into the emperor's inner chambers. The palace gates swallowed her whole. It was not the golden roofs or the endless stone courtyards that disoriented her. It was the silence. The way sound disappeared after the 5th gate, as if every footstep was caught in silk. She was assigned to the pavilion of Winter Garden, a holding residence for unassigned women. Her days were regimented. Wake at dawn, wash in cold water, kneel in prayer, sew 10 rows of perfect stitches, copy 10 lines of verse, walk 10 laps in silence. Discipline over desire. And yet, the politics had already begun. Girls with louder voices tried to draw attention, stirring inspections. One played the flute under her breath as they worked. Another spilled tea in front of a senior eunuch, just to be noticed. Mei did none of this. She watched. She waited. She learned which servants listened behind doors and which ones did. She learned how to walk noiselessly on marble, and she learned how to bow without lowering her gaze too much. It was a concubine named Lady Su who noticed her. Lady S was not favored anymore. Her eyes were lined with bitterness more than coal. But she still held status from her earlier years. She walked through the training pavilions once a week, selecting girls to serve as temporary handmaids or hairdressers. Most of the new girls feared her. Mei offered to polish her mirrors. That was all it took. Within 2 weeks, she was moved from Winter Garden to Chrysanthemum Court, Lady Su's private residence. It was a step closer to the heart of the harem, but it was also a step deeper into its cruelty. Lady Su's court was elegant but suffocating. The air smelled of camphor and lotus root. The walls were lined with silk paintings of autumn, leaves metaphors for fading beauty. And Lady Su was never without her fan, a peacock feathered thing she carried even indoors, using it to gesture, to signal, and when needed to strike. Mei's job was simple: arrange her hair, read poetry aloud in the evenings, and listen. Especially listen. Lady Su had enemies, just other concubines, but within her own household. Maid, who had once been caught stealing sandalwood oil, a guard who lingered too long near her doors, even the calligraphy tutor. Who dared correct her? Scrolwork. Mei became the eyes and ears. She never spoke unless addressed. She never denied or affirmed a rumor. She simply delivered observations in quiet tones, wrapped in poetry or metaphor. Lady Su called her my little knife in silk. But the emperor never came. Lady Su had once been beloved during the 10th year of his reign. But time is unkind to concubines. She had aged past the curve of favor. And though she still sat high in ranking, her chambers were rarely visited, and so she plotted. In the 4th month of spring, word spread through the palace like incense on a breeze. The emperor was seeking a new companion, not a concubine, not officially, just someone refreshing. The term itself was vague, deliberately. So, it could mean anything from a temporary guest in the banquet hall to a long-term favorite in the bedchambers. Dozens of women were preparing, and Lady Su saw her chance, not for herself, but through May. She dressed a girl in white. No rouge, no ornaments, just simplicity. She told her, say little, let him ask. And then she sent her to the chrysanthemum banquet, where the emperor would pass briefly among his court to choose who would serve him tea. Only 5 girls would be selected. May was the 6th, but fate has sharp teeth. One of the selected girls, an arrogant niece of a regional governor, collapsed just before the procession. Too much ginseng wine, not enough humility. The eunuchs panicked. Protocol demanded 5. Lady Su, already watching from behind a screen, stepped forward and offered May. She's quiet. She won't embarrass you. And just like that, May entered the banquet hall. The emperor did not notice her at first. He was speaking with an old general about the border skirmishes. His brow was furrowed. His fingers drummed on the table. May poured the tea silently. Then, instead of stepping back immediately, she folded the silk napkin in a specific way, 3 folds to the left, 1 to the right. It was an old trick her mother had taught her, used by entertainers in the South to signal messages during performances. The emperor paused. He looked at the napkin, then at her. She bowed and stepped back. 3 nights later, a summons arrived, not for Lady Su, for May. She was escorted to the pavilion of whispering pines. The air was heavy with sandalwood. The emperor sat alone by a pond, feeding koi with black sesame. He did not ask her name. He simply said, I knew your mother once. Briefly, she sang like a river moving over stone. May said nothing. He looked at her. You don't sing? She shook her head. Good, he said. Then you'll listen. For the next 2 hours, he spoke of war, of border disputes, court betrayals in court. She said nothing, but she remembered everything when she was dismissed. She was not told if she would return. She bowed and walked away, but her name was recorded. In the ledger, no rank, no title, just E in May, entered at spring banquet. And in the margins, someone wrote a single word in red ink. Useful. The second visit was unannounced. It came 6 nights after the spring banquet. A silent eunuch in a pale yellow robe appeared outside Lady Su's chambers after the evening bell. He held a lacquered tablet. No words were spoken aloud, but Lady Su bowed so deeply her forehead nearly touched the floor. When May was handed the silk shoes lined with cinnamon bark, a sure sign she was to walk the inner paths of the Forbidden City, she knew what it meant. She had been noticed, and in the palace, being noticed was both a blessing and a curse. The pavilion of whispering pines was not a place of luxury. Despite its poetic name, it had no carved dragons or pearl inlays. It was sparse, stone floors, a single table, no women, and soft slippers, and a chair with a view of a moon gate. May understood quickly. This was not where the emperor played. It was where he thought, and she had been chosen, not for her beauty or charm, but for her utility. He asked her no questions instead. He read reports aloud while she copied them in a separate hand. He recited the names of border cavernous while she mapped their alliances from memory. She was not treated as a concubine. She was treated as a living archive, and yet she was still his. She returned to Lady Su's chambers with no explanation, no elevation in rank, no new silks, no jewelry, only silence. And in the palace, silence could mean many things. But to Lady Su, it meant power. She understood the unspoken dynamic. May had entered the emperor's mind, not his heart, and that was more dangerous than any love affair, because concubines came and went, but useful tools were kept sharp. Within weeks, May was summoned regularly, not nightly, not even predictably. Sometimes 2 visits in a week, sometimes none for a fortnight, but always the same rhythm. Silence, observation, memory. She was shown maps. She was asked for recollections, and once, so only once, she was asked a question. The emperor stared at her for a long moment, then said, "What would you do if you found a snake in your garden?" She answered, "I would not look for a stick. I will listen for its rustling, and I will follow it back to its hole." He nodded and said nothing more. In the 7th month, she was given a title, court listener. Not official, not public, but the servants began to call her that, and other women began to fear her, because no one knew what she told him or what she heard. One afternoon, she walked past the pavilion of falling plum blossoms, where favorite concubines embroidered. Under white canopies, a girl named Lian Hua whispered to another, "They say she doesn't bleed. That's why she can enter the inner court." May said nothing, but she remembered. That same week, Lian Ho's brother and assistant minister was reassigned to a remote post near the western desert. Coincidence? Maybe, but in the Forbidden City, coincidences were counted like coins. Too many. They weighed you down. The danger didn't come from below. It came from beside her. Lady Su grew restless. She had expected to rise alongside May, to be elevated as the one who trained her. But the emperor never summoned Lady Su again, and soon whispers began that May was no longer just a listener, that she advised, that she corrected his scrolls, that she once dared to contradict an edict. Before it was issued, none of these rumors were confirmed, but Lady Su stopped speaking to her, and then, one day, Lady Su's chambers were sealed. No reason was given. May was moved to her own pavilion. A modest place, bare walls, a plain screen, a garden of silent moss, but it was hers, and she understood what that meant. In her new role, she learned to move carefully, to speak less, to notice what others missed. The color of robes in the hallway, the tone of a eunuch's cough, the way certain scrolls disappeared before banquets. One night, a minor concubine was found weeping in the jade courtyard. She claimed she had seen a ghost, an old maid who had drowned in a well years ago. May simply wrote a report. There is no ghost, but there is a gap in the wall between the storage room and the west corridor. Someone is watching. The next morning, guards filled the corridor. The ghost was never seen again. It was not a glamorous life. May still sewed her own hymns. She still washed in cold water, but her name became known carefully, quietly, not in poetry, in footnotes, in the margins of court documents. She confirmed. She remembered. She advised caution. Never the subject, always the echo. And yet even echoes can be dangerous. In the 9th year of her service, during the festival of moon lanterns, an incident occurred. A paper lantern, in the shape of a crane, caught fire near the Imperial pond. It was nothing, a gust of wind, a frayed string. But the next day, the emperor asked her, "What else burns this easily?" She answered, "Secrets." He smiled, then asked, "And what carries them?" She paused, then said, "Fans." It was a reference to Lady Su, to a Pika feathered fan, to the dagger that had once been hidden within it. The emperor nodded, and never brought it up again. But a week later, all fans were banned in the inner court, even silk ones, even ceremonial ones, and no one mentioned. Why? Years passed. May aged quietly. She was never called beloved, but she was never forgotten. When she turned 30, she asked to retire to a convent in the southern mountains. Her request was denied, but she was allowed to leave the inner court. new pavilion was prepared for her near the archives, and for the first time in her life, she was given an official title, Advisor of Memory. Still not a concubine, still not a minister, but something in between, a shadow that lived between silk and scrolls. In the final years of the emperor's reign, he would ask for her once a season. They would sit by the pine trees. He would speak of floods and treaties, and she would listen, and sometimes, rarely, she would answer. She never asked for reward, never petitioned for favor, and never loved. That was the price to survive. Her last recorded words in the court logs were as follows: "The ink that endures is not the one that stains the robe. It's the one that hides between lines." No poetry, no legacy, but her words are still there in the footnotes, in the shadows of law, in the silence of memory. She no longer wore hairpins. The jade pieces had been removed by her own hand. In the final stage of her court life, it began each morning before the bell, not from habit, but from memory. Her body had learned the rhythm of stillness. Her feet never hurried anymore. Her robes, now of an adorned dove gray, moved like mist along the stone. Pathways between the archive pavilion and the emperor's library. There were no more summoning tablets, no more ceremonial silks, only the scrolls, the silence they required. And even that silence had changed. Where once it had meant secrecy, now it meant absence. Absence of danger, yes, but also absence of meaning. May had become what she had always feared, invisible, not by necessity, but by design. The Forbidden City had a way of softening those who lingered too long. It carved at the memory like wind. On stone, the palace, records so meticulous, so vast, had no entry for her birth name, only the assigned title, Advisor of Memory, pinned at 2 marginal notes in judicial reviews and foreign envoy briefings. But who remembers the margins? China, maid, now lived in a small quarter, once used by a retired tutor from the Hanlin Academy. The ceiling leaked during monsoons. Her meal portions were standard servant fare, and her voice, once measured and necessary, was rarely required. And still, she stayed. Why? Because she had seen the consequences of leaving. Years earlier, a favored concubine named Zhao Zuzan had begged for retirement. She had hoped to return to her family's estate in Suzhou. The emperor had granted her request with ceremony. But 1 year later, a letter had arrived detailing her sudden death from a fever. May knew the truth. There had been no fever. Shao Xian had carried too much memory outside the walls. So May chose stillness. She chose the scrolls. She found a new rhythm in categorizing old documents. There were travel records from decades past, sealed in wax but never read. Border treaties signed in winter ink. Inventories of jade sent from the mines in Yunnan. Letters from disgraced ministers. Confessions from concubines. She read them all, not out of curiosity, but out of duty. Because in the palace, forgetting could be fatal. It was said among the older eunuchs that the emperor still remembered her. That once, during a storm, he had asked, "Where is the woman who wrote with silence?" But she was never called again, and she never asked to be. One evening, while reviewing the scrolls of the Spring Flood Relief Program from 10 years earlier, she came across a document she had copied herself, her own handwriting, preserved like a fossil. The line read, "Divert the rice shipments through Ba Prefecture. Avoid the river route." It was an order she had quietly amended on behalf of the emperor after learning of a rebellion brewing near the canal. Her change had saved Congress, but her name was nowhere on the decree. Only the minister's seal remained. She traced a line with her finger, and for a moment, she allowed herself a small smile. It was enough. Seasons turned. New concubines arrived, girls of 15, with pearl combs and trembling hands. None of them knew her, but the eunuchs did. They bowed not deeply, but with a certain caution, because they knew what she had seen, what she remembered. The new emperor, a nephew of the old one, had never spoken to her. He allowed her to remain in the archive pavilion, untouched, a relic, neither punished nor prized, just preserved. In the final year of her life, a visiting scholar from the South was granted access to the archive. He was preparing a treatise on the military strategies of the late dynasty. He asked for assistance interpreting an old set of border, correspondences. May read them aloud. Her voice was steady, low, without inflection. The scholar paused. You read like someone who was there. She looked up and said only, I listened well. He didn't press further, but he never forgot her. Decades later, in a footnote of his published work, he would write, a woman of the inner court, unnamed, provided invaluable context. She knew not only what was said, but what was meant. It was the only known record of May in any historical document, and it was buried in the back of a dusty appendix, but there it remained, unchallenged. True, Dutch. Her death was unremarkable. The Imperial Death Registry listed her as advisor of memory. Female, approximate age, 62. Cause, decline of breath. Burial, garden of clear silence. There was no procession, no visitors, only a simple tablet, carved without adornment. But even the stonecutter remarked, she must have mattered. They buried her near the pines. In time, the Forbidden City forgot her. New rulers came. New lovers were chosen. The pavilion she lived in became a storage area for lanterns. The garden pond filled with moss, and her name, whatever it once was, vanished from speech. But occasionally, a court scribe working in the archives would notice an unusual consistency in the oldest scrolls. Neat hand, a precise rhythm, like someone writing while listening to the sound of footsteps. Outside a paper door, what does it mean to matter? Is it to be loved, or to be remembered? Or is it to have quietly shaped the course of history without asking for recognition? In the case of May, the concubine, who became a listener, then an echo, then the shadow, it may be that she mattered most precisely because she never demanded to. She endured, and in a palace built to forget its women, she remembered. The first thing she learned was how to walk without making a sound. It wasn't a lesson anyone taught her directly. There were no instructors in silence, but silence was expected the moment she passed through the fifth gate and entered the outer chambers of the women's quarters. It was there, beneath the heavy lacquered beams and the echoless corridors, that Leanne's name began to blur. She had been called Leanne since Chtalalatis, because she had been born on the day her village pond bloomed. But as she crossed the stone threshold into the rear palace, she was given a designation, 4th class attendant, batch 2, autumn selection. From that moment, her name was less important than her posture. Her identity mattered less than her predictability. And so, she began again. She was 16. Her hands had never worn rings. Her feet had never worn silk. But they dressed her in both. The back courtyard of the Forbidden City was not the painted, storybook garden that foreign travelers imagined. It was a place of constant rearrangement, endless shifting of bedchambers, scrolls, lanterns, duties, and silences. Every morning began with the registry. A eunuch, whose face she would never see clearly in daylight, sat behind a bamboo screen and read the names of those summoned for duty that day. The concubines sat on their heels, arranged by rank. They were not allowed to speak unless their name was mispronounced, in which case they could raise one finger to correct it. Leanne's name was mispronounced 3 times in her first week. After that, she said nothing. She simply accepted the distortion. There was a kind of safety in being slightly forgotten. Her official role was textile attendant, which meant she was assigned to the linen chambers behind the imperial sleeping hall. She worked with 12 other women, each responsible for a specific task: folding, embroidery, washing, dyeing, mending, sealing. Inventory. Leanne was given the task of matching silk thread to robe panels. The silk came in bundles, sorted by tone and purpose. Ceremonial golds, midnight, purples for mourning, Tyros reds for weddings, and a pale, almost white lavender used in dreams. That last color, soft and rare, was never ordered, but it was always stocked. She once asked another girl, why? The girl didn't answer. She only shivered and gestured toward the inner chambers, where the dowager Empress lived in almost permanent dusk. Leanne never asked again. By her second month, she understood that the palace wasn't just a place, was a system, and systems run on ledgers. Every bolt of cloth was recorded, every handkerchief washed, had a tag. Every robe altered had a note logged in the ledger of amendments. That ledger, kept in a wood-bound folio, was under the sole care of an old eunuch named Seema. Seema did not speak. He had lost his tongue in a punishment years before, but he had eyes like ink drops and a memory like a spider's web. He moved silently through the corridors and checked every robe, every thread count, every garment assigned to every consort. Leanne watched him, not out of fear, but out of fascination, because in a place where everyone whispered, here was someone who could not. And yet, he saw everything. The concubines rarely spoke to eunuchs directly. It was considered improper, even dangerous. But one morning, while reorganizing the silk bundles, Leanne dropped a spool of twilight blue thread. It rolled across the chamber, directly to Seema's feet. He looked down at it, then at her, and then, with a flick of his sleeve, he kicked it gently back. No words, but something passed between them, a sort of recognition, as if he knew she was watching and didn't mind. That was how it began. Each week, she returned the amended robes to the ledger table, quietly waiting for Seema's review. He would make marks, sometimes in red, sometimes in black, depending on the correction. She noticed that he often double-checked the robes, destined for one particular woman, Consort Anne. Consort Anne was not the highest-ranking concubine, nor the most beautiful, but she had influence, and more importantly, she had the emperor's attention. On the 7th and 12th days of every month, the other women watched her with a strange combination of fear and envy. Leanne simply noticed the patterns. The 7th and 12th, the red silk on the 5th, the scented sachets on the 6th, the special embroidery, phoenix feathers, and pine trees, always delivered in secret. One day, Seema summoned Leanne to assist him with a backroom inventory check. No one else was present. The chamber smelled of dried ink and powdered rice glue. He pointed to the scroll shelf, then to a series of robes wrapped in muslin. She understood, matched the garments to the scroll records. Hours passed. Not a word was spoken, but slowly, as they worked side by side, she realized that the robes told a story. Some had been altered 3 times. Some were never worn, but still repaired. Some were marked with invisible inconly, seen under candlelight. Seema handed her a robe with phoenix embroidery. He pointed to a faint mark near the collar. Squinted. It was a stitched character. An, not just a robe. A robe that had been tampered with, not ruined, but adjusted by someone other than the usual tailors. Seema watched, her eyes widened, then closed the muslin over the robe and placed it back. No words, but the message was clear. Someone was rewriting the wardrobe, and possibly rewriting the woman inside it. That evening, Leanne lay awake in her shared quarters, thinking not of the robe, but of the pattern, what was being hidden, or worse, what was being prepared. Consort Anne was being positioned for something beyond the usual favors and visits, perhaps elevation. It was a dangerous game. One often ended not with honor, but with exile or poison, and Leanne, who knew too much, was now part of the game? She had seen the altered robe. She had seen the false stitching. And though Seema had said nothing, she felt the weight of his silence like a stone pressing against her ribs. The next day, Seema didn't appear. He had never missed a review before. Lian asked quietly, too quietly, perhaps if he was unwell. No one answered. No one even blinked. That night, the ledger table was empty, the scrolls untouched, the robes unmarked, and the silence that followed was no longer gentle. It was foreboding. Why had Seema vanished, and who, now, was watching the robes? The morning after Seema's disappearance, the routine went on, exactly as before. The incense still burned in the same brass pots outside the Hall of Purity. The attendants still recited the morning registry, voices dull with memorization. The servants still swept the walkways as if dust might dare disturb the emperor's silence. But the air inside the textile chamber had changed. Lian returned to her corner near the thread bundles and began her daily task of sorting silk by hue. Yet her hands were slower than usual. She caught herself pausing mid-match, her fingers hovering above shades of indigo and plum, lost in the thought of Seema's blank space. It was not just that he was absent, it was that no one had mentioned it, as if he had never been there. His ledger had appeared. His name was not read at morning roll call. The wooden stool he used sat where he left it. But the cushion had been removed. To question was dangerous. To remember was worse. But Lian did both. She remembered the ink marks. She remembered the phoenix-stitched collar. And most of all, she remembered his eyes. Quiet, weightless, but sharp enough to see through thread and lie alike. 2 nights later, the palace entered a hush deeper than usual. Word had not spread officially, but through the silent glances and closed doors, the concubines understood. There had been a death. One of the lower consorts had passed some sad illness. Others said accident, and still others, in whispers behind fans, said nothing at all. But Lian heard a different version. One of the laundry girls, who worked the night shift, rinsing the emperor's robes in cinnamon bark water, said she saw a servant wheel out a body wrapped, not in burial cloth, but in a ceremonial robe, bright crimson, lined with white fox fur, a robe usually reserved for presentation, not for death. The next morning, Consort N was promoted. No official ceremony, no fanfare, just a discreet change in her title, read aloud during the 4th hour by a eunuch with a dry throat dot from consort to noble consort. Lian didn't look up from her spools, but she felt the ripple. The robes were telling a story, again, and someone had just rewritten the ending. In the weeks that followed, the textile chamber received a series of unusual requests. Robes of certain colors were to be embroidered with very specific patterns: mandarin ducks, bamboo stalks, clouds arranged in sets of 5. A pattern known in court symbolism to represent harmony, longevity, and heavenly favor. But these weren't meant for the emperor. They were for his mother, the Empress Dowager, and it was Lian who was tasked with organizing the silks, not because she was favored, but because she was reliable, invisible, careful. She began to realize that the robes served more than vanity. They were messages, subtle and veiled. Each stitch a letter, each hemline a whisper, each thread a hand placing a piece on a game board she wasn't meant to see. But she was seeing it now, and once you learn to read the robes, it becomes impossible not to see the signals. Then one morning, Seema returned, just like that. No announcement, no explanation. He resumed his position behind the ledger table as he had never been gone, but something had shifted. He was thinner. His robes were cleaner to clean, and when Lian placed a robe before him to be recorded, he did not look at her dot. He only made the mark and waved her on. The ink was not black dot. It was gray dot, faint, almost vanishing. Later that week, Leanne found a message folded into the muslin wrappings of a robe. It was not addressed to her, nor was it marked in any recognizable hand. It was a line of poetry, written in elegant brushstrokes. Even a silkworm, once silent, would chew through jade to escape. No signature, just a single pressed plum blossom tucked into the crease. She did not show it to anyone. Instead, she memorized it and burned it that night. She dreamed of a worm eating through thread after thread until it emerged in a place without robes or rules, a place where her name might be Leanne again. Soon after, changes swept through the palace faster than usual. Several textile attendants were reassigned. New eunuchs appeared in the registry chambers, their accents thick with northern dialects. The Empress Dowager seal began appearing more frequently on robe orders, seemingly ordinary requests. But Leanne noticed the timing, not always following a promotion or a punishment. She began stitching slower, taking more time to feel the weight of the fabric. Some robes felt heavier than others, even when they were made of the same cloth. Some felt haunted. One robe, intended for consort Anne, arrived without measurements. No size, no instructions, just a note. Matched the stars. She embroidered it with constellations, tiny golden knots, patterned like the sky over the forbidden city. She sent it off and never saw it again. But 3 nights later, she heard the guards whisper of a vision, a woman walking the night corridor, in a robe that shimmered like the Milky Way, heading toward the Emperor's private quarters. No one knew if she returned. As autumn approached, Leanne's hands grew stiffer. Too many hours with the thread, too many nights lying still. One evening, working late under candlelight, she heard a knock on the outer silk door. 3 soft taps, then silence. She opened it and found a bundle on the ground. No note, just a single robe. It was Sima's, but it was too fine for a eunuch. Rich navy silk, lined with silver trim, and in the lining, a familiar symbol, the character Anne. But this time, it had been slashed with a blade. She brought the robe back to the ledger table. The next morning, placed it carefully before Sima. He looked at it, then at her. For the first time in months, he nodded, and then, with slow fingers, turned to the back of the ledger and wrote a new name. Not N, but a single symbol. Hui, Ashdod. He tore the page from the ledger, rolled it, handed it to her, then turned away. Leanne understood what it meant. The robe had passed through the fire. The game was over. Someone had been burned, perhaps. Consort Anne, perhaps someone else. But the robe remained. A remnant. A warning. She took the page and tucked it behind her binding sash. That evening, she climbed to the upper gallery above the embroidery chamber, where no one ever went. She unrolled the page and read the ink one more time. Ash, no date, no signature, just a final note in the ledger that had once kept the court in order. Some months later, a new concubine arrived, another girl with a name like a flower, another face prepared with pearl powder and shy glances. Leanne was asked to prepare her robes. She measured her in silence. The girl asked nervously, "Will I be safe here?" Leanne did not answer. She folded the silk, smoothed the seams, and reached for the soft, pale lavender thread, the color reserved for dreams and for secrets, because the robe was always watching. And now, Leanne was the one writing the story in stitches. But what would she choose to write? By winter, the hush that once cloaked the palace had thickened. The corridors remained swept. The senses remained full. The rituals followed their schedule with unyielding regularity. But beneath the predictability, something else moved. Something quieter than footsteps, more fluid than incense smoke. In the shadows of court life, the robe had begun to speak in ways Leanne no longer had to interpret. She felt it in her fingertips, in her spine, in the stillness of the fabric before her. Needle pierced it, Sima's final message, the one marked only with the character for Ash, had not been seen again. She had not dared to show it, nor even to mention it. It remained folded behind the inner lining of her robe sash, warming faintly against her ribs. It's like a forgotten ember that refused to die. She had returned to her work as if nothing had changed. But something had, and it was not just her. With the turning of the lunar year, a ceremony was scheduled in the Hall of Felicitous Harmony. It's not a grand state affair, but something smaller. A robe dedication. Symbolic. Quiet. The concubines selected to attend were chosen by rank and, more mysteriously, by rotation. A method no one questioned aloud, but everyone whispered about. Leanne was summoned not as a guest, of course, but as a textile attendant to deliver the robe. The robe in question had been commissioned weeks earlier by the Empress Dowager herself, pale gold, lined with phoenix plumage luxury that hadn't been requested in over a decade, and embroidered with a strange combination of symbols, pine branches, double cords, and, at the hem, 2 cranes flying in opposite directions. It was the kind of robe designed not to flatter, but to declare. Declare what? No one could say. Leanne's job was only to carry it, fold it, present it at the right moment. And yet, as she waited in the vestibule outside the ceremonial hall, a robe in her arms, she realized something curious. The thread used in the crane's wings, silver, silk spun with a rare black-tipped filament, was her own selection. Not by request, but by instinct. She had chosen it weeks ago when finishing the hem. At the time, it had felt like a quiet act of rebellion, or artistry, or something in between. The color was subtle, almost imperceptible in low light. Plunder flame, it shimmered like ash again. The ledger had followed her hands, and now she was walking it into the Emperor's chamber. Inside the hall, the concubines sat in rows, like petals around the throne dais. The throne itself was unoccupied. The Emperor, they said, had fallen ill. He had not been seen in public for weeks. The Empress Dowager presided in his place. Her figure austere, unmoved, wrapped in a robe so dark it swallowed the candlelight. She gestured without words. Leanne entered. She knelt, unfolded the robe, and waited. The hall held its breath. Then the Dowager spoke. Only 2 words. Who stitched? A pause. A beat. Leanne's voice was almost a whisper. I did, Your Grace. The Dowager looked at her, a long, unreadable look. Then, stand. It was not a request. Leanne rose, and for the first time in her years of silence and thread, she stood in the full center of the court's gaze, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as the one who carried the story in silk. That night, Leanne did not sleep. She returned to her quarters, folded her work robe, and sat by the lattice window, where winter light filtered through like cold breath. She took out the ledger page again, read the single word. Hoy. She set it near her oil lamp, and instead of burning it, she rewrote it with a tiny brush and watered. Ink. She added 1 stroke. Hui became hui. Ash became brilliance. A word not of death, but of light. In the days that followed, a strange new order emerged. Several senior eunuchs were reassigned to provinces. The Empress Dowager increased her control over robe commissions. Concubines, who had once jostled for prominence, suddenly became quieter. A few left for temples, others simply vanished from the registry. The term used was always the same. Recalled 2 family estates, but there were no families to return to. Sima was never seen again. His seat at the ledger remained empty. This time the cushion, untouched, the inkpot dry. But a new ledger appeared, and Leanne, inexplicably, was asked to keep it, not as a eunuch, not as a noblewoman, but as a robe master. A role that did not exist until it did. No one gave her a title, only responsibilities. She would log every commission, every spool of silk, every design, down to the last knot, and she would choose the thread, all of them, in the spring. The girl with the soft lavender robe, the one who had arrived so recently, was seen walking in the garden with two other consorts. She smiled easily, laughed once, and wore a robe that shimmered with birds in flight, stitched in a pattern only Leanne could have designed. She had not stitched it to flatter. She had stitched it to protect. Each bird curved inward, wings open, eyes turned to the sky. A symbol of evasion, of freedom within the cage. Leanne knew she could not protect the girl forever, but the robe would do what she could not. Years later, long after the emperor passed and his son took the throne, long after the empress dowager was enshrined and silenced, long after concubines became empresses and then exiles, Leanne continued to sit beside the spools, her hair silvered, her hands slower, but her vision as precise as ever. Young attendants came and went, often too quickly to learn more than 3 stitches, but Leanne remained, and with every robe she approved, every thread she selected, every symbol she allowed or refused, she wrote quietly in the margin of history. She never raised her voice, never issued a command, but across decades, every figure of power, empress, eunuch, emperor had worn her work. Not one of them had escaped her thread. She was, as one junior attendant once whispered, the woman who stitched the palace. And still, none of them ever knew her name. Just the silence of the robes, the memory of a ledger once kept in gray ink, in a robe that shimmered like ash. And so, centuries later, when modern scholars examine the surviving imperial robes, now displayed behind glass in temperature-controlled cases, they marvel at the artistry, its precision, the subtle shifts in design from decade to decade. They study the threads and patterns, but they do not know. Leanne, they do not read the stitch that never appeared on any registry. One hidden knot, placed just beneath the collar on every robe she ever stitched, the knot that meant, I was here, and maybe, still am. They said the peach trees had been planted for her, not by her, and certainly not with her permission, but for her, a gesture, a symbol, a mark of favor from the emperor whose face she had only seen twice in her life. The trees were young when she arrived, new saplings staked into carefully arranged soil behind the north quarter of the palace, but they bloomed dutifully every spring, bright pink and faintly aromatic, visible through the slatted wooden screens of her private quarters. That was her world, a world of filtered light, quiet footsteps, and the never-ending rustle of silk. Her name was May, though it had been changed upon entry to the palace. Now she was simply known by her title, Xiao Marinmei, the Lady of Elegance, a third-tier concubine, one of dozens, selected not for wit or birth, but for a single compliment paid to her complexion at the gate of her village, a compliment from a traveling official who remembered her face long enough to write her name into a regional roster, to be reviewed by a royal attendant in the capital weeks later. And so, like a letter carried by winds she couldn't see, she had found herself whisked from her childhood to a chamber lined with polished stone and silence. And the trees, she never touched them, never walked beneath them. That garden belonged to the palace, but the petals drifted into her courtyard with the breeze. That, she told herself, was enough. Her chamber measured 6 paces by 10. It was neither large nor small, neither lavish nor barren. It contained one window, one embroidered screen, small inkstone she was not permitted to use unless summoned to compose a poem, and a stack of texts she was encouraged to read but never annotate. The only thing in the room that was hers, truly hers, was the bronze mirror by her bedding mat, round, ancient, and slightly oxidized at the rim. The mirror had once belonged to her grandmother, She had hidden it in her travel bundle when she was taken from her home. That bundle had been searched at the border, but the mirror had been missed. In the mirror, her face remained young, quiet, and unchanged. Everything else around her grew older, colder, or replaced. But the mirror stayed. Days passed without names, only tasks. Each day began the same way. A bell in the outer hall, soft. Footsteps of an attendant checking water levels. The rattle of curtain beads as trays of food were placed on the lacquer table. The food was not extravagant plain rice, preserved vegetables, occasionally a stewed egg or thinly sliced melon. Breakfast was served weather. Court not one had eaten the night before. Lunch followed precisely 3 hours later. Then tea, then a gap. Long enough for a nap, embroidery, or to stare at the window. Then dusk. Then evening oil was delivered, a small dish with enough fuel to burn for 3 hours. She learned not to waste it. In summer, she embroidered. In winter, she simply sat still. Her rank afforded her no visitors. The empress rarely summoned third-tier concubines, and the emperor had not visited her since her first month in the palace, when a quick audience had resulted in a polite smile and no further summons. That suited May. The other concubines whispered, speculated, hand-maneuvered, but she observed quietly, and the palace taught her everything. It taught her the temperature of power, how one day favorite lady servants could bustle confidently down the hall only to disappear the next, their names struck from the registry. How gifts sent by the emperor were always accounted for in a separate ledger, and that the ledger was monitored by 3 eunuchs who never smiled. How you could tell when someone had lost favor, not by the food they received, but by the delay in their morning water. How hairpins became lighter when power grew heavier. She watched and waited. She had not bled in 3 years. There was no one to notice. She marked the change in a tiny corner of her bedding mat, using a sliver of burnt wood and rubbing it faintly against a cloth weave. 1 line for each month that passed without blood. She did not fear it. She welcomed it, because it meant she was being forgotten, and forgotten concubines lived the longest. One spring, the petals stopped falling. At first, she thought it was the wind. Then she thought the trees had died, but the wind still came, and the trees still stood. The petals simply stayed on the branch. Weeks passed, and still they remained. It was unnatural. She asked one of the younger attendants, the girl who brought her tea and dared to make eye contact once every few days. The girl said nothing at first. Then, in the lowest whisper, they were lacquered. May blinked. Lacquered. She whispered back. The girl nodded, then walked away. It was not until the following week, when an official from the Ministry of Rights toured the northern quarters, that May understood. The emperor had ordered the trees preserved for a mural to be painted of the eternal bloom. A message of imperial longevity, symbolism. She had lived with those trees for nearly a decade, and now they had been frozen in time. A reflection of the concubine who never changed. It was during that season of lacquered petals that she was summoned. Again, not to the emperor, but to the Department of Rights, to write a poem. It was rare and suspicious. No one requested poetry from a forgotten concubine without reason. She was given a fresh brush and a single prompt, reflecting on stillness. She wrote 8 lines. Only 2 were remembered. The wind still knocks, but no one opens. The petals fall in their dreams alone. The poem was copied, submitted, and, quietly, never attributed. But days later, a mural appeared on the eastern colonnade. Its inscription, "The petals fall in their dreams alone." She did not smile, but she knew. Someone had read her words. Years passed. More murals, more silences. The girl who once whispered about the lacquered trees was replaced. No one said why. The food remained the same. So did the water. So did the mirror. She was now past 35 and elder among concubines. No one said so. No one dared. She had become the ghost of the palace. still breathing, still present, but not truly seen. And that was a power none of the others understood. A power you had to earn by being patient enough to disappear. The summer after the mural appeared, the rain refused to come, not just in the northern quarter, where May's room stood in its unchanging silence, but across the entire capital. The skies hardened into an oppressive white, not blue, not clouded, just blank. It was the kind of heat that pressed against the stone walls and turned the tiled roof into a lid. Water arrived only once a day now, a silver bowl, not quite full. Even the lacquer blossoms seemed to sweat. May watched the petals fade to a duller pink, the color of dried blood on silk. Still glossy, still poised, but they no longer caught the light in the way they once had. They no longer pretended to be alive. She found that strangely comforting. So many things around her were pretending. The palace pretended it was eternal. The concubines pretended they were beloved. In Shizhao, Mayrin, third tier, no audience. In over a decade, pretended she had a place in this world. Even though the world had moved on, it was during this dry spell that she began to sense something beneath the stillness. Not change exactly, but rearrangement. Servants changed routes. Attendants no longer paused at the end of the hall. One afternoon, the court eunuch who used to inspect water bowls each morning failed to appear. The next day, his duties were performed by someone younger. The ledger he carried, the one where he recorded each concubine's consumption, condition, and state of health, was left on a tray by mistake. May did not open it. She only looked at the spine and saw, faintly etched, names of still living. It did not list the dead, it listed the forgotten. Once a month, each concubine was weighed. It was a tradition that began centuries earlier, ostensibly to monitor health, but in truth, it served two purposes, one bureaucratic, one symbolic. Bureaucratically, the palace needed to ensure no lady within its walls carried an imperial child without notice. The swelling of bellies was a matter of succession, of inheritance, of cosmic balance. Symbolically, the weight of a concubine indicated favor. A favored lady grew heavier, plumper from the meals, the attention, the softness of life. A woman who lost weight too quickly was either ill, disgraced, nearing removal. May had not been summoned to the weighing chamber in 3 years. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Then she understood. They no longer expected her to change. She was static, like the lacquered trees, still breathing, but unmoving, still present, but unmeasured. A weightless person, and in the hierarchy of the palace. Weightlessness was both invisibility and safety, until the new eunuch arrived. He was not unkind, but he was thorough. He knocked once, he entered without waiting, and scanned the room with the crisp boredom of someone performing a task for the first time. He asked no questions, only gestured toward the bamboo mat. Stand. She did. He wrote something on his tally sheet and turned to go. But at the door, he hesitated, then looked back. You have an age, he said, not quite as a compliment. She did not reply. He nodded, as if confirming something, and left. She knew. Her name had just moved further up the ledger. The next week, the emperor died. It was not announced formally, not at first, but everyone in the palace knew. The incense in the upper halls changed scent from jasmine to sandalwood. The drums stopped at night, and every servant, every guard, every eunuch who had once shown even a flicker of confidence now bowed lower and walked faster. There is a particular kind of panic that moves like a shadow through the shadow. Forbidden city, not loud, not rushed, but total. No one knew who would ascend. The eldest prince was rumored to be illegitimate. The second had been exiled. The third was young, and the fourth was ambitious. The empress had no sons of her own, and the concubines, all 219 of them, held their breath, some literally. One woman collapsed from anxiety. Another shaved her head in mourning before the rituals were announced. Third tried to escape through the laundress gate, was never seen again. May sat at her window, and looked at the peach trees. Dust had begun to settle on the lacquered petals. The garden was not clean that day. No one remembered it existed. She took a cloth and wiped down her mirror, then sat down to embroider a leaf that no longer grew. When the emperor dies, the concubines are divided. Some are retained in the palace to serve the next emperor. Some are retired with a small pension, relocated to remote estates where they are not permitted to remarry. And a few those who were favored, or young, or politically useful are reclassified, but others are sealed, not with wax or decree, but with silence. There is a tradition, unspoken but real, that certain concubines are left behind, not out of cruelty, out of preservation. They are housed in small quarters in the western annex, given food, water, and a daily check by the eunuchs. But they are not spoken to, not summoned, not referenced, their names removed from the active roles. They are alive, but not considered living. It is a kind of tomb, one you enter breathing and remain until you don't. May was moved the day after the announcement. It was not a procession, no attendants, no ceremony, just a cart and 2 guards. She was given no time to pack, but she took the mirror and one unfinished broidery 3 leaves and a half-stitched flower. The new room was smaller, no window. The air smelled of ink and dust, but it was clean and cool. Her new ledger name, Jim Flower. It was not a title, not even a name, just a condition. She was one of 9 women relocated to that annex. They did not speak. They were not allowed to, but occasionally one would leave a folded note beneath the tea tray once. May found a haiku. No bell in this room yet. I rise at dawn again. Habit or hope, friend? She copied it in her mind and added her own reply, left 2 days later beneath the tray. Neither, she wrote. The body walks while the soul sits. It was never answered, but a week later, someone left her a plum pit, the silent currency of grief. The annex where Zhao Marin now resided was a strange corner of the palace, never shown on maps and never mentioned in official ledgers. It was not hidden, exactly, but it was ignored with such persistent thoroughness that it might as well have been buried. The hallways had no windows. The doors bore no names, and the rooms were nearly identical bare, save for a cot, a table, a basin, and a mirror. The silence was deeper than any she had known, and in that silence, time became strange. At first, May tried to mark the days, scratches on the wooden wall, one for each sunrise. But soon she began to lose track of whether the marks matched the real count or the imagined one. Was that a 4th mark or a 5th? Had she skipped one? Had the eunuchs arrived twice that day? Or was that yesterday? Cave-in, the tea changed so little always. Warm, slightly metallic, poured in the same shallow cup that had offered no clue about the passage of time. Eventually, she stopped counting. Instead, she began arranging the fallen strands of her hair into tiny designs on the stone floor. A petal, a wave, a branch, something to say, I was here. I made a pattern. I named the silence. But even those were swept away each morning. It was not punishment, simply protocol. Everything must return to its pristine, blank state. The eunuchs assigned to the annex were among the youngest in the court boys, barely trained, sent here for discipline or demotion. They spoke very little, and when they did, their voices were hushed. Once, one of them dropped a wooden tray and gasped, not at the sound, but at the realization that he had broken the rhythm. Disruption was the only crime here. Zhao Marin never spoke to them, nor they to her. But once, during one of the many quiet mornings, she noticed something tucked beneath her tea bowl, a slip of cloth, folded 4 times, unmarked. She opened it slowly. It was a poem, not hers, not one she'd written, but one she remembered. She had heard it once before in the court's music chamber. Years ago, recited by a visiting scholar. It was about a plum blossom blooming in frost delicate, unseen, and quickly forgotten. She ran her fingers over the cloth. The lines were written in careful strokes, slightly trembling, as though the writer had used a brush held too tightly. She pressed the cloth to her cheek, then folded it back. The next day, she left a single word written on rice paper. Doing, understand. The cloth did not return, but neither did the silence feel quite as sharp. Months passed, or perhaps years. One morning, she woke to find the door to her chamber ajar. It had never happened before. No sound of guards, no footsteps, just open. She sat up slowly, waited. Nothing. She approached the threshold. Beyond it, the hallway stretched long and dim, as always. But at the end, a flicker of sunlight, trill sunlight. Not lamplight, filtered through a broken shutter. That shutter had never been opened before. Something had changed. Perhaps eunuchs had rotated. Perhaps someone had forgotten a lock. Or perhaps some unspoken shift in the dynasty. Another death. Another name rising on the imperial seals had allowed the boundaries of her little tomb to loosen. She stood in the hallway for a long time, barefoot on the stone, not knowing whether to go forward or return. And then she did something she had not done in years. She stepped outside. The garden she emerged into was overgrown. It had once been part of the Empress Dowager's southern walk, secluded path lined with camellia bushes and peony beds, but now it was wild, untended, its hedges thick with ivy, and its pond rimmed with fallen leaves, and in the middle of it, a boy no older than 10, sitting cross-legged with a scroll. He didn't notice her at first. Then he looked up and blinked. "Are you a ghost?" he asked quietly. Shao Marin tilted her head. "No," she replied, her voice surprised even her. He nodded, satisfied. "They said ghosts don't have shadows." She looked down. Her shadow was faint, but there the boy stood. "Do you live here?" "I used to." "You're someone important?" She smiled. "Used to be." They met often after that. Never by arrangement, just by shared habit. The boy Long was the son of one of the emperor's scribes. Bored of his father's endless scrolls, he had taken to wandering during midday lessons. The southern garden, now forgotten by most of the court, had become his refuge, and now hers. She did not tell him who she was, nor did he ask again. Instead, he talked about poems. He read to her from the scrolls he smuggled out of the library. She recited lines she had memorized from her own girlhood. Once, he brought ink and paper and asked her to write something. She wrote a 4-line verse about a mirror with no face. He read it in silence, then asked, "Why does the mirror forget?" She answered, "Because everyone forgot to look." He didn't fully understand, but he nodded as if he did, and in that moment, she felt less forgotten. In the 8th winter, since her seclusion, if the seasons were counted, right, a fire broke out in the eastern quarters. No one knew its cause, but by morning, 3 buildings were lost, and with them, portion of the court's ledgers and records. When the flames were doused, the servants rushed to salvage scrolls. Among the debris, the register of concubines was found half-burned, names singed, titles smudged, and in the margin of one page, a short annotation, legible but fragile. Shao Marin, no longer under imperial record. No longer under record. She had finally been erased. Not punished, not buried, simply removed. No trace, no duty, no obligation. She was, at last, free. In the spring that followed, Liang stopped coming. She waited 3 days, then 5, then 10. On the 11th day, she left the garden. She walked the southern path, past the annex, through an unlocked gate, and out into the city. No one stopped her. No one looked. The world had forgotten, and in forgetting, it had finally let go. No one knows where Xiao Meiren went. Some say she became a village healer. Others say she joined a Buddhist temple and took a vow of silence. A few legends claim she returned. Decades later, as an old woman, cloaked in linen, to light a single incense stick at the Imperial Shrine, her face unreadable. Her name unknown, but history does not record her beyond that burned margin. The court never amended its registers, and her poems, if they survived, were never attributed to her. But sometimes, in the southern gardens of the old forbidden city, a single blossom appears each spring on a tree that has long since stopped blooming. A white plum, delicate, unnoticed by most, but those who see it say it leans slightly toward the west, toward the annex, toward a room with no weight, and a mirror that once held a face.